Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the WellPoint Studios here at InsideLowell. I am your host, Teddy Panos, and today we're going to introduce you to a candidate for the United States Senate. But first, let me thank a few of the folks who helped make this podcast possible and all of our InsideLowell podcasts. And start, of course, with the folks from WellPoint. WellPoint is the only health plan offering healthcare benefits exclusively to Massachusetts GIC members. At WellPoint, your whole health is their whole point. Also want to say a quick thank you to the rest of our sponsors, and you'll see their logos scrolling across your screen there as you're viewing this, but it starts with our friends at the Washington Savings Bank. Make the switch now to Washington Savings Bank. TMI Properties, quality and value at every price point. Find your perfect space with TMI. Boston North Company, business solutions for restaurant and retail. Mahoney Oil, providing warmth and protection to Greater Lowell since 1925. Francis E. Prevention Insurance, the agency Greater Lowell has counted on for over 41 years. And last but certainly not least, our friends with the Massachusetts Pirates, bringing all the hard-hitting action and excitement of arena football to the Mill City. And with that, I want to introduce you to my guest for this Inside Lowell podcast. As I mentioned, he is the Republican candidate running against Senator Elizabeth Warren in the upcoming November election. And he's here in the WellPoint Studios with us, John Deaton. John, thank you so much for taking a little time out of what I'm sure is a crazy schedule for you now that we're in the home stretch to the general election.
Listen, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I look forward to this conversation.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that's what it is, a conversation where we'll learn a little bit about you and the positions you stand for. First of all, you kind of hosted in the Republican primary. It wasn't very suspenseful. Did it feel that way during the campaign and during primary day, September 3rd?
Listen, I was grateful. And when you have three people on the ballot, I've never run before, so I'd ask people, what was considered a strong statement, and generally I would say, hey, with three people on the ballot, if you can get 50% of the vote, then that's outstanding. We got 65%, and I think it's more of just the message is resonating with common sense. And Elizabeth Warren is actually struggling in the media. She's being asked questions about me, and she's struggling to come up with criticisms of my policies, because I tell people it's hard to argue against common sense. And I think that when 65% of the voters in the primary, Republican and unenrolled, make a statement and say, hey, yeah, we can get on board with this. This is what we need. We need some common sense leadership.
All right. So I want to get into the issues, and you've got them all laid out on your website, very detailed in a number of them. But first, a little bit about yourself. Tell us, a little bit about your background and what made you decide you wanted to be a United States Senator.
Well, I come from a very unique background. I was born into intergenerational poverty in a city in Detroit, a place called Highland Park, a very violent neighborhood. In fact, people can Google it. Highland Park, Michigan, ranked in the top 10 worst neighborhoods in America for the last 40 years. My mother was stabbed. We lived off welfare and food stamps. I had a deadbeat dad that sort of abandoned us in this neighborhood, 6 of us kids. And it was a struggle. My mother was stabbed when I was 6. Unfortunately, I was raped for a period of 2 years by a predator who would threaten to kill my mother if I told anyone, and after watching her get stabbed, you can imagine that was a pretty powerful threat. My first day of high school, I had a gun shoved in my mouth, and I became a high school dropout, just like everyone in my family. And eventually I found a private high school, and a little tiny Catholic high school with a principal named Terry Urquhart, great man, gave me a break, said he'll cut the tuition in half, but made me earn it. He made me have a 3.5 grade point, play 2 sports, be active in the church. And I was the first to graduate. I got a job waiting tables, washing dishes after practice, after high school, paid for high school, paid for college, and came to Boston and achieved the American dream here in Boston by graduating New England School of Law.
So I knew absolutely nothing about that part of the story. It's actually, forget running for senator. It's actually a wonder you're sitting here alive today based on a lot of what you've talked about. That's quite an amazing story.
I've been sharing the story, when my mother caught me devastated when I dropped out of high school. And it was 3 months I had been a high school dropout, and she caught me crying. And I'm going to tell your listeners what generational poverty does to people. My mother said, listen, just do what your brother did. Work for 3 years, 17, I'll sign over, you enlist. And that's your ticket out of the hood, right? Military. And I said, Mom, I don't want to do that. I really want to go to college. And my mother put her arms around me. My mother's my hero, trust me. She put her arms around me and said, son, I'm sorry, that's just not for people like us. And that's what poverty, real poverty does. Strips you of your ambition, your self-esteem, your worth. And so at 14, I vowed that I was going to break it. Took me a lot longer than I'd hoped, but eventually did. Listen, I really am the walking, breathing embodiment of the American dream.
Yeah, but eventually you did end up in the military, though.
Yeah, that's the irony.
You did so of your own choice. How'd you end up in Massachusetts?
Well, listen, I had only one connection to Massachusetts. Even though I lived in Detroit, I was a Celtic fan. I was a huge Larry Bird fan. Still believe the 86 Celtics is the best team of all time, right? But that was it. I wanted out of Detroit. I was a huge Celtic fan, came to Boston, didn't know anything about Boston, Massachusetts, went up to the security guards at New England School of Law, Miguel and Jose, still there, friends of mine to this day. Said, hey, guys, where do you recommend I not live? Because I don't know anything around here. And they said, you might want to stay out of Roxbury. My next question was, how do I get to Roxbury? And that's where I lived because, I was used to a much worse type of sort of neighborhood. And Roxbury was a step up as far as I was concerned. And I lived in Roxbury, East Boston, my second year, Malden, my third. And I became overwhelmed with pride. Like, I'm going to be a licensed attorney. I knew that with my work ethic, I would eventually make money and get out of debt. And decided to join the Marine Corps. And one of my proudest moments is I couldn't afford Harvard Law, right? To be honest, I probably couldn't have got in, right? But couldn't afford it. But I beat out Harvard, BC, BU, and Suffolk Law. And the Marine Corps chose me to represent the entire Commonwealth for the 1994 Judge Advocate Law contract. And went in the Marines, 7 years, got hurt, not in combat, but in training, got medically retired. And I've been a lawyer here in Massachusetts for 22 years, representing people with mesothelioma and lung cancer caused by asbestos against corporations and insurance companies. And so that's what I've been doing.
So you could have basically coasted for another, 20, 30 years, hit retirement. You had made, especially from where you came from, you made yourself a successful person. You lived the American dream.
I did.
Now you're throwing yourself out there into the fire where your entire background, your life, every single policy position you hold and have held, or something you may have written in a college paper, whatever.
Right.
All of it's going to come out into the open. It's not easy running for office, and I admire anybody who does it and anyone who serves, because there is a significant level of sacrifice to that. When did you decide to run? What made you decide to say, you know what, I'm going to throw my hat in the political arena? It
was a conversation with my daughters. I really am the American dream, and I see it dying. And I question, could a kid do what I did today? Are they been priced out of the economy? Is it impossible? And so I started thinking about it. And I talked to my two oldest daughters, Livy and Jordan, and I said, look, girls, Daddy's thinking about running for office. And girls, I'm not going to start off small. I'm like going to tackle one of the most entrenched Washington insiders, elites in D.C., the darling of the progressives, right? Elizabeth Warren. And my daughters looked at me and said, Dad, we love you. We think you're great at everything you do, but we think you're going to lose. And that's the kind of relationship I have with my daughters. I said, why? And they said, because you're just too honest, and you'll never say something you don't believe, and you're incapable of selling out. And we think that in politics, you have to be that other guy. And I looked at him and I said, you just convinced me to run, because that can't be the standard in this country. That's not the country I wore a uniform. A Marine Corps uniform for 7.5 years of active duty. And we face crisis, but the greatest crisis, we could talk about immigration, we could talk about the debt crisis, inflation, housing, foreign wars, but the greatest crisis we face is one of leadership. You got Washington elites like Elizabeth Warren who sit back, they fuel division amongst us so that they could stay in power. And I think when you look at the Senate, you don't see someone that overcame poverty, someone who struggled to pay his bills in his 40s, and overcame all those things, and even battled addiction in my life, things that real people are facing. You don't see that, and I think it's time we had one of our own go to the Senate. So
I'm going to wager to guess that most people watching you here or listening to you out there on the trail agree with your daughters that you can't win, John. But for a different reason.
I think I can, but
and that reason is, look, simply you're running in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
You're outnumbered in terms of registered Democrats to Republican 5-1. Granted, this I think we're over 60% now, maybe close to 2/3 of the registered voters in Massachusetts are unenrolled.
You're right.
But you're significantly outnumbered. Elizabeth Warren hasn't really been challenged or come close to getting defeated since she beat Scott Brown. And even in that race, she won by more than most people were predicting. So what's your path to victory? How do you convince people that, you know what, I like this guy, but he doesn't stand a chance? How do you convince them, no, I've got a chance. There's a path here for me.
Sure. And listen, I tell people, I don't BS people. It's not the widest path to victory. There's a narrow uphill path to victory. I put $1 million of my own money in this race. I wouldn't have done that if I had zero chance. And she hasn't been challenged. That's the thing. And I can tell you, let's look at her record. 12 years, one bill has passed that she's sponsored as primary sponsor in 12 years. When she ran for president, she came in third here behind Bernie and Biden. She has a 41% approval rating. Also, remember, there was a poll that showed if Charlie Baker, a Republican, were to run against her in the seat, he crushes her by 15 points. It shows you how vulnerable she is. Now, that doesn't directly translate to me. I'm not Governor Baker. I don't have his name recognition in the state, but it shows you how vulnerable she is. Also, the migrant crisis didn't exist back then. Inflation, we're now the second most expensive state to live in the country. We beat out California. That's not something we want to brag about. Only Hawaii leads Massachusetts now. Housing in the greater Boston area more expensive than California. And so people are being priced out of the economy. And I think that when people see a common sense alternative that's not an extreme person, I'm pro-choice, so on social issues, I'm a moderate. I think that they're going to give me a fair shake. And I think the fact that I got 65% in the primary is indicative of my message resonating.
You mentioned former Governor Charlie Baker. What kind of a Republican would you classify yourself as? Are you a Charlie Baker Republican, or are you more in line of the Tea Party / Donald Trump?
Yeah, you know,
Republican?
I get, and I understand the question. I get it all the time. My first answer is I'm John Deaton, Republican. There is no one like John Deaton in the Senate. I can assure you. I am a truly independent thinker. I'm not loyal to a party, an agenda, or a person. But yes, you know, if you force me to say, you know, are you more of that Tea Party Trump Republican or Baker Republican, I would lean towards obviously the Baker side. But, you know, I'm trying to do something which a lot of people don't like, which is I'm trying to get rid of these labels. It really saddens me that you have, you know, these labels, MAGA, Rhino, right? MAGA versus Rhino, Rhino versus MAGA. You know, we need to start focusing on, you know, the 80% we agree on and not the 20% we disagree on. And so, you know, I won the primary despite I publicly stated that I'm not supporting President Trump. Doesn't mean I'm voting for Vice President Harris, and we can talk about that. And a lot of people said, there's no way you'll win a primary if that's your position, John. And I still got 65% of the vote because I'm the right messenger. You know, I can look Senator Warren in the face because if you look at the last time she ran against President Trump. The first thing she said in her debate was, my opponent supports Donald Trump 100% of the time, and then went on to say Donald Trump's name 15 times. I've taken that away from her. That's why she's struggling. But I can also look at her and say, don't tell me that 74 million Americans that voted for President Trump are all misogynistic, racist, bad people, because they're not. Why? Why did you have to switch candidates? Why was President Trump going to beat President Biden? You can't say it's because they're all bad people. It's because we have a broken system and tens of millions of Americans are not being heard. And I can validate that message.
We're chatting with John Deaton, Republican candidate for United States Senate. He'll be on the ballot November 5th. And also, over the next couple of months with mail-in voting and early voting, challenging incumbent Senator Elizabeth Warren. Let's get into some of the issues. The economy. People say, you know, unless you're in wartime, it's always the economy. James Carville's famous. It's the economy, stupid. Most indications now that the kind of the dirty little secret that the economy is not faring very well, starting to get peeled away. Jobs numbers, they're starting to drop. even though unemployment, you can debate the intricacies of those things, but in terms of job numbers, they were revised downwards $800,000 for this year.
Correct.
What's happening out there in the economy? Why are we losing people from the workforce?
Well, I would agree. The economy, and here in Massachusetts, the two prevailing issues is the migrant crisis that's bankrupting the state and the inflation. Like I said, look, I went to Dunkin' Donuts and in downtown Boston, I got a muffin and a medium coffee, and it was $7.50. Just to give you an idea, people are being priced out of the economy. And the reverse of the American dream has taken place, right? You used to, parents, the goal was to own your own home. Now their kids can't own their own home, and parents have to take a home equity loan on theirs home, which is maybe paid for, to give to their kids. And so the economy is going to drive it. And it's so bad that people are seeing that failed leadership of Washington, D.C. is why we're here. And you can't trust the government. When the government tells you that inflation's coming down, they use, the PCE core inflation index. Guess what 2 items are excluded? Energy and food. All right, what are the 2 most expensive things that are pricing people out of the economy? Electric bills, fuel for gas for your car, and groceries. And so, no, I agree. Word is out from the street. The economy's not doing as well as everybody says it is.
Even with the exclusion of food and energy, the inflation percentage they're using today, which is, by the way, different from what they used in the 1970s and 1980s, still did not look good for the longest period of time. Yet there are those who tell you, well, it's more a product of corporate greed and this new term that we learned over the last couple of years, shrinkflation. My chocolate bar is smaller, right? My box of cereal is smaller, right?
Right.
Is there legitimacy to that? Do corporations bear some responsibility for what's happened with prices for middle class and lower income Americans?
Well, there's no doubt, but let's realize that inflation is caused by government spending, right? 80% of all U.S. dollars has been that's in circulation today has been printed in the last 4 years. That shocks people. If you look in January 2020, there was $4 trillion U.S. dollars in circulation in the world. Today, 4 years later, it's 20 trillion. You cannot debase your currency to that extent and then expect there not to be inflation. So the primary culprit of inflation is out of control government spending, and that's something that we need to really tackle. We're at 35 trillion, personal credit cards at 1.2 trillion, student loans at 1.7 trillion. We're going over a financial cliff in this country. We pay $3 billion a day in interest alone on our debt, but our leaders aren't paying attention to this. The debate, the presidential debate, didn't have one question on debt, on the national debt, and what the plan is about. We're operating at 1.7 to 1.9 trillion dollar deficit every year, and so something's got to be done with that. Elizabeth Warren and others, they want to engage in the class warfare. If you look at groceries, you're talking about the groceries make 7 cents on every dollar, right? It's a 1.7 margin business. So I'm someone who's fought greedy corporations and insurance companies for the last 22 years. So are there abuses in the system? Yes. But let's focus on the real culprits. The real culprits are career politicians like Elizabeth Warren.
All right. I'm glad you mentioned the deficit and the interest, the debt and the interest on the debt. Over $1 trillion a day. It surpassed that, I believe, 6 months ago. You could do a lot of things out there. Now, granted, you'd have to stop spending that much to bring the interest payment and therefore the debt down.
Right.
But you could do a lot of things with $1 trillion to help people out of generational poverty.
Sure. Let me tell you something. I want your viewers and listeners to fact check me, just to give you an idea how large the trillion figure is. Because when I was young, they would talk about millions. When I was in college, government spending would talk about billions. Today, they talk about trillions. If you take 1 trillion seconds and ask how many years does that come up to, it's 37,000 years. That's how big the number $1 trillion is. So you are right. If we could take $1 trillion, we would solve homelessness. We would solve poverty in this country in many ways. Yet our government is operating at a 1.9 trillion loss every year.
You mentioned immigration, and I want to talk about immigration policy and border policy. It's costing Massachusetts about $1 billion a year, and I'm not sure that's accurately reflecting it, because I think the education and long-term housing issues that it's causing are also going to be significant. But there was a bill in the United States Congress that folks said, well, this will solve it. How would you have voted? If you were in the U.S. Congress, how would you have voted? Would you have pushed to have that bill come forward, and would you have voted for or against it?
Yes, I would have voted for it. I've been on record saying it. It's not a perfect bill, but I went to the border. When they took the rec center from the poor kids in Roxbury to house the migrants, that struck home at me, because I'm one of those kids, right? I grew up in that environment, and I know that you take one of the few amenities these kids have, they make bad choices on the street. So I said, let's go to the border. When I went to the border, I was shocked. I talked to border security. I learned that they have bus stops along the border. The migrants don't run. They just come, they wait, they get picked up. They don't have any identification. You don't know what their name is or where they're from, whether it's true. They're released within 24 hours, and they're given an asylum court date of 2032. 2033, 8-9 years from now, you know they're not coming back. And then they're just released, and they come to places like here. And I'm glad you brought up schools, because the $1 billion+ that's hard numbers. You're taxing urgent cares, emergency rooms, our education. It's not just a right to shelter law. We got a right to educate law. So it's impacting public education here in Massachusetts. And so although it wasn't a perfect bill, it stopped the bleeding to a certain extent. So what you have to do is you try it, triage, right? You got to stop the bleeding, then you can go back and improve it more. And Elizabeth Warren not only voted no, she also objected to President Biden's executive order that placed a $2,500 per day cap. It's because she's not here. She doesn't experience the impact that this is having on the Commonwealth. And so, yes.
Okay. So you mentioned the cap. I remember reading it was 5,000 per day was the cap before they kind of shut the border down. It may have been revised downwards, but I did the math. Take 365 days times 5,000. You're allowing 1.8 million more people into the country before you even try to stop the border.
Right.
That was the biggest point against it from the folks who said, no, we're not doing this. It may not have been Senator Warren's reason for objecting.
Understood. And that's why I said it's not a perfect bill. But you have to, it's more than, listen, 12 million have crossed. That's the accurate number, at least from the border people that I spoke to when I went to the border. When you count getaways, we're talking about 12 million people have crossed. And so I understand that. But you have to, it was better than the status quo, is the point I'm making. And one of the things that I said we got to get back to, why can't we have single issue bills in the United States Senate, right? Why the Ukraine funding bill should be called the Ukraine funding bill, right? It shouldn't be infrastructure bill, and we're going to send this money, and we're going to mix, veterans should be veterans bills. And so an immigration bill should stand on its own, and we could always go back and improve it. But when I went to the border and saw how bad it is, I was like, we just got to do something. This is an emergency. I tell everyone, 12 million. So even if we assume 99% of the migrants are good people, we can make that assumption, and 1% are bad. That's 120,000 bad guys that maybe walk through our back door. God forbid if Deaton is off and it's 95% that are good. And 600,000. It's a national security risk. So, I learned that in the Yuma crossing alone, they've captured 100 people on the terror watch list. I asked Border Patrol, okay, how many did you not get? They're like 4 or 5 times that, John. You're talking about 500. Like, people on the terror watch list who are sworn to do harm to this country are crossing. And so we have to do something.
What do you do with the folks who are already here? This was actually asked at the presidential debate the other night. There's 12 million here. Number, I think we can agree, is probably significantly higher. But we've always had a level of it. What do you do? Do you create some kind of a path to amnesty? Do you start mass deportations? What kind of policy would you support?
Well, the first thing you have to do is secure the border. Right? Stop it. I said we need to expand legal immigration. Let's expand it, make it easier, make it better. Zero tolerance for illegal immigration. That's first. Second, I said some level of deportation has to be part of the problem. President Obama deported more people than President Trump did. And so deportation is always a part of the solution. Now, when you talk about mass deportation, I don't favor people who've been here for 20 years. They have children here. Their children are American citizens. Even if a migrant crossed 3 years ago, if they've had a child here, that child is a U.S. citizen under our laws. There are gray areas. But you start with, did you commit a crime in America after you crossed the border, other than crossing the border illegal, right? Yes, you're out, right? If you were released, as President Trump is saying that, prisoners have been released from other countries, you are a felon from your other country and you cross, those are easy calls, right? It's after you make those calls and deport those people, then it gets a little more complicated. Are they working? Did they have a child? Do they not? But deportation has to be a part of it.
It's not as easy a call as you just said it was. And you would think it is, but just the other day, somebody was arrested on Cape Cod for rape of a minor, and they were actually released in New York. So we're seeing a number of these cases, but
we live in the bizarre world sometimes. I wake up, when I went to the Rockland Hotel, there used to be a Comfort Inn where the minor was raped by a migrant, and then that person was given $500 bail. Right. And then, of course, disappeared until it was rearrested. But, those should be easy decisions. Okay. And they're not. I get it. I get what you're saying. But
and I also want to talk, though, you mentioned people are here illegally. Some folks will tell you, well, they're not here illegally. They're coming in through the system. They're in some ways, they're being welcomed and they're being flown in by the United States government. So there is a legal path to entering a country and asylum, and whether it's economic hardship or facing persecution, whatever, which seems to be being used now as a way to get these folks in here and bring them in, quote unquote, legally. Do we have to change our immigration laws?
Oh, absolutely. We need to. Listen, one of the things that I believe needed to be reinstituted was the agreement that they remain in Mexico until their asylum court date. And I explained to people, because someone challenged me that said, no, they're all here legally. I was on a radio host and I was being challenged because I used the word that we do have illegal immigration in this country. Oh, no, they're all here. No, I said, well, if you look at the asylum laws, I'm a lawyer. Look at the asylum laws, you're supposed to seek asylum in the first jurisdiction you enter that you're not being persecuted. So you should have saw it in Mexico if you're using Mexico as a pathway. But there are people who are taking advantage. The guy that raped the kid I was just referencing was cleared in Haiti from the internet and then flown to JFK, where the sponsor was in New Jersey, but then got a bus here to Massachusetts. And so, that person could be here legally because of the administration's policy. But the reality is we've got to secure the border. We got to reinstitute, ending catch and release and remain in Mexico until your asylum court date.
All right. You brought up Ukraine earlier. Today, it is believed the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, is going to announce that the United States has given Ukraine permission to fire missiles deep into Russia. Is that an escalation, a dangerous escalation that could drag us into World War III, or is that a necessary step to protect American interests in the NATO alliance?
Well, I think it's a pretty scary process that we're going down. And, I believe, regardless of what John Deaton thinks, Vladimir Putin has stated that if that is allowed, then he will declare that there is a war between Russia and the United States, because the United States is now, basically allowing weapons to enter Russian territory and kill Russians. It is an escalation. And that's one of the things that I referenced about we're in these multiple crises, including foreign wars. I'm very concerned. I'm running for United States Senate, and I can't tell you what the policy is in Ukraine, because we don't know one. Are they just going to keep coming back every 4 months and asking for more billions? What's the strategy? What's the plan? And where's the transparency? I want to know where every dollar is going and what it's being applied to, right? And so, but the administration, unfortunately, isn't getting on camera and telling the American people, here's our strategy in Ukraine and why we're doing this and what the path to peace is or any of that. It just seems to be incremental escalation every few months. And now we're at a very troubling escalation, in my opinion.
All right, let's talk about a couple more domestic issues here. Abortion. Yep. That's an issue. I'm pretty sure that in the two debates you have with Senator Warren, that's going to come up. The woman's right to choose, and we're going to hear about IVF and whatnot. Massachusetts is a relatively, if not liberal population as a whole, certainly far, yep. They're very moderate in terms of these issues. Where do you stand on the repealing of Roe v. Wade by the United States Supreme Court, and where do we go from here?
All right, let me make sure people understand this. Senator Warren has claimed that this is the single biggest issue in the election. I've challenged her to a 1 hour or 90-minute debate on abortion and women's reproductive rights alone. I've asked her, she could pick her moderator. I am pro-choice. I have 3 daughters. I'm a pro-choice candidate. I do not favor late-term abortions unless the fetal anomaly, the fetus is dead or the fetus won't be able to survive a birth or life of the mother. And I favor parental consent and all of those things. But I am a pro-choice candidate. Elizabeth Warren is literally out there knowing that, telling people that I'm going to help support a federal ban on abortion. Right? She's misleading people and saying that when she won't accept a debate on this issue. And so I do think it's an important issue. And I think that in a 50-50 Senate, I would be able to prevent a federal ban. I know some Republicans disagree with me, obviously, on this issue, but I believe that Dobbs' decision shouldn't have overruled Roe versus Wade. I believe it became a right after more than a half a century that was embedded in American freedom.
Supporters of that decision say, look, it should have been a legislative issue all along, and especially a state legislative issue. Others are saying, look, the United States Congress needs to step up and codify this. Do you believe the U.S. Congress, and that includes the Senate, of course?
My first bill in the United States Senate will be a bill for term limits. And a U.S. Senator gets 2 terms. That's 12 years. A congressperson gets 6 terms. They're each 12 terms. If you can't effectuate change in more than 12 years, then step aside, let someone else have an opportunity. My second bill will be the codification of Roe versus Wade.
All right. That's not a very Republican position, or at least traditional Republican position.
I understand that, and I understand and respect people who disagree with me. And we've got to get to a point where we can talk to each other, not talk at each other. I understand people who vehemently disagree with me, and I get this is my position. I believe that the laws of Massachusetts got it right. And that it is between a woman and a doctor, and that choice until a certain extent, until a certain point. And it's just something I feel strong about, and it's a reason why Elizabeth Warren won't accept this challenge. She would rather lie to people and say the guy who says he's going to offer a bill to codify Roe is literally supporting a federal ban on abortion. It's nonsense. And I think when people see that contrast, they're going to resonate with my message. Even if you disagree with me, at least I'm honest about where I stand, and I'm not disrespecting the other person's viewpoint.
One more position that I think is going to have traditional old school Republicans lose their mind, and that is your stance on marriage. I came across this on your website as well. Yeah. You're an attorney, so you kind of spoke about it from a legal standpoint, but what is your stance on marriage and by extension, LGBTQ plus rights?
Well, I would tell you this. I have a very libertarian view. I believe in freedom, right? And so when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Joe Biden only believed in civil unions and that marriage between a man and a woman, I was like, we live in America. If it's 2 adults, love who you love, marry who you mother. Are we in a free country or not? And so I believed in that gays have the right to get married if they want to get married. Do I support, everyone will say, are you pro gay rights? Are you pro LGBTQ? Or are you pro this or that? I say I'm pro civil liberties, right? I'm pro freedom. And that's where I'm always going to stand. Now, that doesn't mean I support, biological men boxing biological women and things of that nature, right? But I do support gay marriage before the Supreme Court said that it was a constitutional right.
All right, and last topic for now, energy. The Green New Deal.
Do not support the Green New Deal.
Okay, you got that out of the way early. What should be our energy policy going forward? Should it be drill, baby, drill, or should it be we've got to completely move away from fossil fuels and find the power of the future?
We're producing more oil than Saudi Arabia right now. That's a fact. So drill, baby, drill is not, we are already drilling. That's not, we have to have a multifaceted plan that's smart of energy transition that would include solar, wind, even small limited nuclear, right? Which doesn't get talked about enough. We have to be a smart plan. And the problem with New Green Deal is that you can't set arbitrary dates in a global crisis and handicap American entrepreneurs and American businesses where China or India or Russia or anyone else doesn't have to comply with those standards. It has to be a global approach. And so also, you can't just say we're going to have all the cars are going to be electric by this date if you don't have the infrastructure to support that. And unfortunately, I view things like the Green New Deal as simply rhetoric trying to appease to a certain group. Let's talk about common sense. I told you I'm a common sense candidate. Let's literally use common sense in this approach. And you want to know something? When you foster innovation and technology, what state does well? Massachusetts, right? MIT, Harvard, our storied educational institutions, we do well. And that's something that I'm going to support.
And you talked about innovation. AI is
yes.
a lot of talk about that. We are rapidly accelerating now the pace of our AI. One of the concerns with that is energy. And I believe if not today, then in the very near future, a bunch of folks as part of the AI thing are meeting with the White House to talk about the energy demand. I've just recently read a number of articles about how much energy those artificial intelligence computers are going to require and the drain it's going to put on our system. Should we be kind of like barreling full speed ahead towards AI to get some of this technology before our enemies, China, et cetera, do? Or do we need to kind of pump the brakes and go, where are we going and what are the side effects of this?
Right. Well, the one thing you can do, AI's here and it's here and it's going to be here, but there are some scary thoughts about it. We can't have this approach, when it comes to technology. For example, Elizabeth Warren has a bill that bans Bitcoin self-custody, which also uses energy, right? And renewables and all that. But we can't have this approach that we ban stuff. And we have to take a common sense approach to it. So no, I would support some kind of commission of experts to guide us. We can't have politicians. Why I support term limits. You're going to have people in their late 80s and 90s making votes on artificial intelligence, blockchain technology. I don't think that's what we need.
All right. Should we be kind of monitoring information / disinformation on the internet and kind of shadow banning?
No, listen, I believe in the First Amendment and people's right to free speech. And it's very scary what's happening now. The left used to be basically people who would fight for First Amendment. Now the vice president nominee of the Democratic Party is saying that, you don't have a right to free speech in certain ways, right? So hate speech, for example. I don't want hate speech. You don't have the right to not be offended, right? I served in the Marine Corps. I served so that you have the right to be offended, not that you have the right to not be offended. Plus, I don't want those people, hate speech people, to go underground where it can foster. Like sunlight is where we expose that. And so it is very concerning that you have the government involved in the way it has been in suppressing information. That's a fact. And that's something that can't be allowed.
All right. Folks want to learn more about your candidacy, these issues that we talked about here. As I said, they're spelled out in detail, and there's a number of them on your website.
Sure.
How do they do so?
I appreciate it. It's John Deaton for Senate johndeaton.com, johndeatonforsenate.com. And listen, I know people don't think that I can win this race, and I'm sitting here, not standing here, telling you that I can win this race. They've went so far left that they've offended center-left people, and the policies are really crushing regular people. And I think I'm going to shock the world and surprise everybody.
Interesting you said that. I was thinking you'd have made a hell of a Kennedy Democrat back in the 60s.
Well, I got to tell you something. I'm not a partisan person, right? My loyalty is one test. Is it good for Massachusetts and America? If it is, I'm all in. I don't care who the president is, right? That's my approach. And if you think about the Senate, that should be the approach of anyone in the Senate. Is it good for America? And if it is, support it. If it isn't, not support it. And I think we need someone who has a loyalty to the Constitution and to their voters, not a party, not a person, not an agenda. And I think that's something that I bring, and I think it's what people are ready for.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time, stopping here in the Mill City.
I appreciate you.
Good luck out there on the campaign trail. Hopefully we can connect with you and your opponent at some point going forward.
Would love it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. And I thank all of you for joining us here as well. Hope you learned a little bit more about John Deaton, Republican candidate for United States Senate. Election day is November 5th. Till next time, stay safe, everybody.